A reading from the Gospel according to John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through Him, and without Him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in Him was life, and the life was the light of all people.
Have you ever gotten lost in a crowd? Maybe you can think of experiences in your life when you literally found yourself lost in a crowd. Maybe as a child you were in some unfamiliar crowded public space, a shopping mall, a packed stadium, Disneyland, and you somehow became separated from your family, and all at once you were overcome with panic and dread. Or maybe you were visiting a new city and stepped off a subway train and suddenly found yourself swept up in a migrating blob of people, all moving in lockstep in the same direction, and you were befuddled and disoriented, so much so that you couldn't tell which way was up or down. We've all been lost in a crowd like that. But there's another way of getting lost in a crowd that we are far more likely to be acquainted with. It's that experience of trying to look like everyone else, becoming unobtrusive and inconspicuous and ordinary, blending in and conforming to the norms and expectations of the majority, just to belong, just to be normal, just to not be weird or different. This kind of getting lost in a crowd is likely actually how we humans survived as a species. Like the zebra on the savannas, our ancestors quickly discovered that if we could just figure out how to look and act like everyone else in the herd, if we could just fit in, we might actually avoid getting singled out and eaten. But getting lost in the crowd, doing that, we could survive the dangers and threats that might overwhelm us if we were left to go it alone. But we don't live on the savannas anymore, and we know today that getting lost in the crowd, blending in and conforming, trying to be like everyone else, comes with its own inherent dangers. It can become a convenient way of shirking responsibility or evading important obligations. It can pressure us into denying our true selves and betraying our deepest values out of fear of rejection by the majority. It can discourage us from thinking critically for ourselves or claiming personal accountability for our actions. It can seduce us with groupthink, distorting our view of truth and reality and provoking us to act according to mob mentality. As we continue our series on the life and witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we are confronted with this assertion that to be a follower or disciple of Jesus Christ is to reject this human impulse to get lost in the crowd. Instead, what Bonhoeffer said is that the call to discipleship is to stand alone before Christ. When it comes to following Christ, said Bonhoeffer, the invitation is to become an individual who is no longer protected by the crowd or defined by the responsibilities, loyalties, and expectations inherent to belonging to the crowd. Bonhoeffer puts it this way. He says, each is called alone. Each must follow alone. Out of fear of such aloneness, a human being seeks safety in the people and things around them. Individuals suddenly discover all their responsibilities and cling to them. Christ intends to make the human being lonely. As individuals, they should see nothing except him who called them. Now look, on the surface, this is a message that almost sounds contrary to everything Jesus taught in the gospel, that Christ would somehow intend for his followers to be lonely. I mean, isn't overcoming loneliness and being a part of the Christian community the whole point of Christianity? It almost sounds like Bonhoeffer is promoting a Christianity that is individualistic and personal, self-absorbed even, but that's not Bonhoeffer's intention. His point is simply that the call to discipleship is a call to each of us as individuals. Only we alone as individuals can answer that call. The group, the crowd, cannot answer it for us, because the group will always negotiate or filter that call through its own set of commitments. As we've seen throughout the series, we can't read Bonhoeffer apart from his historical context and the political crisis of his day. When he says that Christ intends to make the human being lonely, Bonhoeffer was addressing an urgent question in his day. In a world in which reality has been turned upside down and everything we once thought to be true is now contested, and everything we once were sure was untruth is now venerated by the majority, how do we know who we really are and who Christ really is and what Christ is really calling us to do, apart from the crowd who would tell us otherwise? How can we know who others are, our neighbors? How can we know what true Christian community looks like? How can we know any of these things unless the call of Christ is a call that first pulls us away from the crowd, so that it is only Christ who speaks? When Bonhoeffer wrote these thoughts on discipleship, the wave of National Socialism was sweeping across Germany like an unstoppable tsunami. The majority of Germans got lost in the crowd, some by choice, some by necessity perhaps, trying to blend in, to conform to Nazi groupthink, to avoid getting singled out. They were all swept up in a wave of Nazi ideology that completely distorted their perception of the world, their understanding of God's will and the nature of good and evil, their sense of moral obligation to the other, to the neighbor, to the Jew. They could not conceive of their Christian faith apart from their Germanness. This is always how the cancer of Christian nationalism spreads. It needs a host in the form of a crowd in order to metastasize. Because its goal is to infect every individual in its path, it never wants to let the individual alone with Christ, for fear that Christ will tell us who we really are, which is the only cure that can defeat it. It was into this historical context that Bonhoeffer argued that to follow Christ meant to stand alone before Christ, apart from the crowd and its responsibilities and claims on our lives, so that as individuals, all we can see is Christ who calls us. Why? Because Bonhoeffer was trying to say that when we look at reality, everything we see is really just an illusion. There's always something in the way, a barrier, he said, that keeps us from seeing the world, other people, even ourselves accurately, truthfully. We think we perceive reality as it really is, but we're actually viewing reality through all these lenses, if you will, personal, cultural, societal, political, maybe even religious lenses. And these lenses, they help us make sense of our world, for better or worse. These lenses, in other words, mediate our experience of reality so that we can live with what we may not understand, what we may not even approve of, what we might even be afraid of. And we use these lenses to transpose our ideals and ideologies and beliefs and biases onto our reality, our past experiences, our assumptions, our prejudices and inclinations, our general worldview. And because we all do this, we do not perceive our reality as it really is. He said we have no direct, unmediated relationship with the world. Everything is distorted. And so Bonhoeffer says the first step in seeing and experiencing reality truthfully is to abandon these lenses. And that's why he says Christ intends to make the human being lonely. And the next step, he says, is to see nothing but Christ, which means to allow Christ to stand between us and everything we see and experience in the world, so that when we look at the world or at others or even at ourselves, it is Christ who mediates that perception and experience. We see and experience everything through that lens of Christ. Bonhoeffer says we can't relate to the world or ourselves or others unless it is Christ mediating our experience. And he points to the Gospel of John and says that this truth is actually baked into all reality. He quotes John chapter 1, the mystery of the incarnation, when he says, "Through him all things were made, and without him, that is Christ, nothing was made that has been made." Bonhoeffer is saying, because Christ has been from the very beginning of time at the center of all reality, we cannot know or understand reality without seeing it through the lens of Christ. I know it sounds so ethereal and maybe even academic, but consider this simply on a very personal level. It's so hard to really know ourselves apart from all those lenses we use to mediate the many perceptions we have of ourselves, like our careers, our achievements, our social economic status, our education, political affiliation, our nationality, our sexual orientation. What would happen if we were to abandon those lenses? And as Bonhoeffer says, if we were to be made lonely before God, what defines us then? How do we know ourselves apart from all these things? David Greibner wrote a parable many years ago about a rich man who went into an antique shop and found what appeared to be a full-length mirror covered up by a heavy canvas. The store owner told the man that he kept the mirror covered up because this particular mirror, it turned out, would only reflect the part of a person that was fully alive to God, which, said the owner, was really bad for business because too many people do not see what they expect to see, and they leave the store without buying anything. Well, the rich man asked if he could take a look, and so the store owner removed the canvas, and the man stood tall in front of the mirror, but to his horror, saw nothing in the reflection except the big toe on his left foot, and that was all. He bought the mirror and took it home and stood before that mirror with his $2,000 hand-tailored suit. He held all his bank and stockbroker statements and his humanitarian awards, but nothing in that mirror's reflection seemed to change, just that big toe. He went to church, sometimes even twice. He even paid his pledge in full. He came back and stood before that mirror, but still no change, just the one big toe. He finally gave away all his possessions, and he stood before that mirror one last time, but still no change, just the big toe. Now helpless with nothing left to do or give or try, he fell before that mirror, weeping, letting go of his need to control, his need to know how the mirror worked and what the mirror required. His heart finally opened, and his eyes were so full of tears that he did not seem to notice the reflection of his whole body, dimly at first, and then with greater and greater definition, filling up that mirror. Bonhoeffer perhaps had something like that in mind when he suggested that we must all stand alone before Christ, apart from all these illusions, all those lenses we use to mediate how we perceive and understand ourselves and our reality, so that Christ becomes our mediator. And our self-perception is mediated by love and grace. And perhaps when we discover alone with Christ that we can live without those illusions, we can then see how Christ stands between us and others, in fact, everything that is, and mediating those experiences too. Bonhoeffer said we can have no direct relationships with the world apart from Christ mediating those relationships. He said, there is no way from one person to another. However loving and sympathetic we try to be, however sound our psychology, however frank and open our behavior, we cannot penetrate the incognito of the other, for there are no direct relationships, not even between soul and soul. He said Christ stands between us, and we can only get into touch with our neighbors through him. We will never completely understand others or even our world, no matter how hard we try. The illusions we construct are like barriers, he said, too thick to penetrate, and the breach between us is just too wide. We need a mediator so that, well, for example, whenever we come face to face with someone who has hurt us, we are actually looking at them through Christ, who in that moment mediates our encounter with that person, so that our response is shaped by our love for Christ rather than the pain that that person has caused. Or maybe whenever we are facing a situation fraught with fear or uncertainty, like Bonhoeffer, we are seeing our circumstances through Christ, who mediates that experience, so that our response is one of trust and obedience to Christ rather than blind resignation to whatever forces or powers might threaten us. 9 months before his execution at Buchenwald concentration camp, Bonhoeffer wrote a poem entitled, "Who Am I?" He had been imprisoned at Tegel for more than a year for his role in a failed assassination attempt on Hitler's life. While in prison, Bonhoeffer wrote essays and sermons, letters to friends and family, poems and prayers, all of which were preserved, published posthumously. His poem, "Who Am I?" I think captures this whole notion of what it means to stand alone before Christ, to try to know ourselves apart from the crowd, and to live with Christ mediating our every experience in this life. And the beauty and power of the poem, "Who Am I?" is that it was not a question Bonhoeffer could even answer for himself. He knew that in the end it wasn't a matter of how he appeared before others or how he even appeared before himself. His identity rested not in the opinions of others or even in his own reflections, but in a source external to himself. Who am I? They often tell me I would step from my cell's confinement calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. Who am I? They often tell me I would talk to my warders freely and friendly and clearly, as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me I would bear the days of misfortune equably, smilingly, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really all that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I know of myself, restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath, as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colors, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighborliness, trembling with anger at despotism and petty humiliation, tossing in expectation of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary and empty at praying, at thinking, at making, faint and ready to say farewell to it all? Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once? A hypocrite before others, and before myself a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from a victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God. I am thine. Our takeaway for today: we are called to stand alone before Christ so that Christ can stand between us and others.